Hi, my name's Tristan Smith. I have a lot of things going on the side of my head, from these little flyovers with hair. And if you're listening, instead of watching this podcast, what you would see, if you were watching it, would be me trying to tuck hair behind my ears, which I don't have because I'm bald.
Trying my best.
I'm trying my best to do it. It's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard when there's nothing there.
Yeah, it's rough. Well, it's hard when there's a lot there too. So life is never easy. That's the moral of this episode. Y'all have a good week. That's rough.
So what are we talking about today? What are we talking about? Tell me a story, Tristan. Tell me a story.
Tell me a story. Yeah, no, we just want to kind of like talk about storytelling in church. That's like, that's what Jesus used with parables, you know, it's what he told everybody to do whenever he did a miracle, you know, except for one time I was like doing some research because I like, when I was like kind of putting some of this stuff together, I was like, go and tell. He says that every time. Then I looked into it and I was like, no, he doesn't. In fact, one time he healed somebody and he was like, don't tell anybody about this because they'll kill me right now.
Well, it was before he had,
at one point.
Yeah, it was before he
said
was
not
public
to.
with his ministry. It was, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. But now he's risen and we're told to go and tell. So that's kind of like what I wanted to talk about is just storytelling in the local church and how do we do that? How do we do that, especially when it's so easy to focus on the numbers and like the big miracles, like the large scale productions, and all of this stuff that is great and something that we should look at. But the bottom line is like Jesus focused on people, and I think we should focus on telling those people's stories and everything.
Which is why he
how he impacted their lives. So
that's why he turned water into wine, because he focused on people. I'm just saying, you know what I'm saying? Like that's one of that's an interesting story too. He said the same thing there though. He said the same thing. He said, "It's not my time yet. Not my time yet."
Yeah, it's not my time.
His mom's like, but
that is it's cool to like see the dichotomy.
Well, here's the interesting thing about that.
He says woman.
Yeah, he
called his mom woman, and that's bold.
He does say. But here's the thing, like, what that tells us is there were other stories that happened before that, because his mom knew, hey, Jesus, we're out of wine. Can you do this? Like, because if that was the first time that he did anything, his mom would freak out. Think about it.
Yeah.
Like,
exactly.
So what else has happened?
No, that's the interesting thing about. That's what I love about like these stories. The bottom line is these made it into scripture because people were telling these stories.
Yeah.
Jesus didn't write this stuff down. He did it and people told stories about it. And then the disciples went and they did it and people told stories about it. And that's what it is. That's how the gospel gets out into the rest of the world, is people tell stories about it. And
that's what fueled
as creatives, that's what we're called to do. That is our basic focus.
Well, that's what fueled the entire New Testament church. They didn't have like a Bible. They didn't have that. We say the word of God all the time, but it's not actually referring to that. We say that in terminology of a published set of books organized in a volume. But that the New Testament church didn't have that to go off of. They had stories. They had real life experiences that spread through stories. And so actually Andy Stanley taught a series on that one time called The Aftermath. It's a really good series. We'll link it in the article. But he talked about, it's a 3-part series, but he talked about that. And he was saying the New Testament church did not have, these things to go off of. They didn't have a New Testament. It was all still being created. And so for them, what they had was an event. They saw an event and heard a story. And that story was so compelling that it compelled other people to follow. And so I think that's the thing we miss out on is like, man, stories, parables are these really incredible stories. And if you think about, like, I'm convinced if Jesus chose to walk the earth today instead of 2,000 plus years ago, I'm convinced he would be a filmmaker. Because what better way to tell stories than through film, through cinematography, through storytelling, through, but he told them in such powerful ways through parables, which actually ups the ante on his ability as a storyteller, because he didn't have anything else to go off of. He didn't have special effects or visualizations or PowerPoints or keynotes or Pro Presenter or, LED walls or, any of that. He didn't have anything. He had to paint pictures with words in people's heads who had limited understanding and limited perspective. Like he had to say it in a way that they would understand, which always cracked me up. If you think about it, you're going like, I grew up, like an old school Southern church, and they were into using these big fancy words. Like they wanted to show that they went to seminary. And so they're up there, like, I'm in Mississippi. They're up there using like the biggest possible words, and no one is understanding what's going on. Like literally no one, they're all in the room just going, yeah, pastor, but they have no idea what this word
means. Just lots of amens.
Lots of amens. No one's really getting it. And that's the thing, is like, we need to do better at, that's obviously it's a little bit of a joke, but we need to do better at telling stories in a way like Jesus would, where people could understand them on their own without having any kind of other perception, any kind of he told life stories to them based on their life experiences.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. That's like, and those stories got out. That's the thing. Like there's one thing, the parables are definitely something to focus on, but like after that, it's stories of real life change. You know, he uses these parables to change people's lives, and then people are going and they're telling, it's documentaries. Now they're telling documentaries about movies that were really good and everything that changed people's lives. So these people are going out and they're telling people, and that's just, it gets me excited to think about us as creatives shifting our focus, or maybe not shifting our focus, but bringing it back to the life change that happens and everything. And so, we have obviously there's plenty of ways to do that and everything. And me personally, my favorite way is obviously through video and through film and stuff like that, because that's what I do. But there's so many different ways to do that across the board creatively. And that's what we want to talk to you guys about today. So heck yeah.
So today we're going to be talking about miracles, big productions, hyper creativity, and attendance numbers. These things can oftentimes, be what we turn our focus on instead of people. Jesus focused on people. So after all, like all the greatest miracles in the world, all the greatest stories in the world, they actually mean nothing if no one is around to tell them. And so that's the piece that Jesus really focused on. He focused on people. So at the center of every one of his stories, at the center of every one of the stories we read in the New Testament or the Old Testament is people. And so we can't disconnect that priority from this. There's humanity at the base of all of these things. And so when we discount that and we just try to make it something grand without people involved, or for us, sometimes we focus on the wins for us are like you said earlier, like we were talking about this before we started recording, was attendance. We look at attendance numbers. That's when we judge how great a church is doing, especially post-pandemic. We're like, how many people you got coming back? Yeah, that's great. But then we can also look into that and judge it based off of how many hands went up. We're like, oh man, X amount of hands went up. But that's not really an indicator either of how great things are going.
Right. Yeah.
Because what are the stories behind that? And that's what actually matters. Like, why was I compelled to become someone different? What compelled me?
Yeah.
Where did God show up in my life?
Yeah. Right. And I do think in the corporate setting, there's a lot of things, and I mean, it just happens. It's human nature. There's a lot of things that are said, and a lot of things that are done. But a lot of times we say, like behind every hand is a story and everything. Where are those stories? Why are we not chasing every one of them? Like if there's a story behind every hand, let's tell the world. Let's tell the world that story. And so that's kind of where I'm at. Like how can we be better about telling those stories rather than just like talking about how many hands went up. That's kind of like where I'm at with it and everything. What do you think, Kev? Like, what do you think is like some of those like ways that we can do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's important to, if you want to do a better job in your church of telling stories, genuinely telling stories, you got to have a process, right? And so what does that process look like? A process can't just be like a random, like your circle of influence and your circle of like perception in your church doesn't necessarily mean everybody. It doesn't mean you know everything that's going on. Like you have kind of your circle of friends and you're aware of X, Y, Z. You might not be fully aware of everything that's going on. So the system and the process for capturing the best stories can't be reliant on you. It can't be reliant on a single individual. The best processes we've seen for this include multiple phases and multiple stages to identify, to go in and get like a pre-selected element of that story. So you have an idea of what pieces you need to capture, have a process for capturing, and then have a process for telling. And that process for telling, in a lot of cases is it's video, photo, social, written, like all these different assets that could be used. And I think a lot of times we have like our idea of storytelling is we have an Easter service coming up, and we want to tell a testimony video for that Easter. We want to have that. And that's like the one time we put effort into capturing a story, or we have a special event or something like that. And we're just trying to get testimonials for that, as opposed to stories. Like stories aren't attached to what we're trying to achieve as an organization. Stories are evergreen. They should be something that lives on the shelf forever. Now, the downside potentially to that, of course, that you have to consider, and this is something that only you can answer as a leader in the church, as a creative in the church, is the story I'm about to tell important enough to tell, even if this person is no longer a part of our church?
That's good.
Because
that's a good question.
That's going to be a reality.
Because,
it's going to be a reality at some point. They may move. They may join another community of believers. You have no control over that.
Yeah, you have to acknowledge there's turnover in everything, and we never really want to talk about turnover in church attendance, but it is a reality, whether it's church hurt, whether it's the bad stuff that that hurts to think about, whether it's church hurt, stuff like that. They leave the faith, worst case scenario, that kind of thing. Or whether it's just like you said, like moving, we have to take that into account. And when you're developing those stories, that's a really, really good thing to think about. Are we doing this for our organization, or are we doing this to bring people to Christ? That's the bottom line question, I think. And obviously you should be asking that about everything, but that's a good way to
well, I mean, it helps you understand, like if you're doing it for evergreen purposes, meaning like it's not going to have some kind of expiration date, and you're not doing it specifically for use at your organization, just putting it out into the world. You just happen to be the organization that's publishing it. So in other words, the center of the story isn't, I think this is always the case when we look at story videos in churches. It's like, such and such church changed my life, and that may be completely true. But now that story has become like, you got to take it offline when they leave for whatever reason, because it didn't change their life enough to stay in your church. So like, focus on telling stories that are more long-term, more evergreen, that are not necessarily just a commercial spot for your congregation. While that's important to tell people what kind of church you are, I think there's validation in that. I think that there's not to be ashamed. I'm not trying to downplay that, but I think it's better for us to focus on telling stories that are about the church at large and about what God has done in our lives. Yeah. Because then it's not about, an individual or a very specific, thing that happened at our church that's, only going to be relevant to someone at the church that saw that and was there to witness it. Whereas a story that has a bigger and overarching impact appeals to many more
kingdom minded.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I don't think that every life change story has to include your church's name. And because there's one thing to talk about it, if that is an integral part of somebody's story and where they met Jesus and how that came to be in their life, that's one thing. But if every story that you ever tell has your name or your church's name in it, I think you might have the wrong idea of what we're doing it for. And I mean, that's harsh. That's the harshest way to say it. But at the same time, I think there's a reality in kind of addressing that, because even the all the way down to the person editing the video or the person who filmed the video, like if I take pride in it in terms of look at what I created, then I'm doing it for the wrong reasons. And all the way back up to the organizational corporate side, if we're having to put our name on every life change story, on everything that Jesus does, then we might need to check ourselves. And so that's a good point. Something that I hadn't thought of until now is like, how often are we telling stories for the sake of growing our church over getting the name of Jesus out and building the kingdom? And
yeah,
so that's a good point.
There's
that's a good thing to think about.
You know, obviously it's going to be published on your church's media platforms. It's going to have a logo closing on it or
right.
whatever. Like that's going to be natural. And we've done this in story videos where we know it was pivotal for, you know, the reason for this story was for the launch of this church. And so you want to reiterate, you know, some of that information. And I think there's a balance there that has to be struck between, you know, recognition and promotion. Like there's, you know, hey, this is something that happened. This is real. Yeah. But if you find yourself in the production of it, having to force the content to make it fit within your boundary, right? Like, in other words, like if I'm having to tell somebody, hey, can you say that again, but this time say such and such and such and such, you know, then it's like, well, no longer, it's really
with everything that,
you kind of start creating your story as opposed to their story.
You're fabricating.
In a way, you kind of are. I mean, you're putting it's a teleprompter. Just write a script. Let's go for teleprompter, baby. Let's just read the script.
No, like, and that, like, we're talking about that, like, specific story videos. This can happen all the way across the board. You know, if you're putting it in if it's every photo you take, if it's everything you write, if it's all for there's one thing to promote. Promoting's fine. We all have to promote. But it doesn't have to be done all the time. And I think
go ahead. Sorry.
Once we do what?
No,
I was just going to say, once we kind of shift, once we shift away from the promotion and into just promoting the kingdom, I think we'll see a surge of people saying, hey, like, I really want that. I want not that church, not that pastor, not that team. I want whatever makes them want to tell these stories. I want Jesus. And I think that's exciting to think about.
One of the things that I find kind of humorous sometimes when I'm on social is I'll see you have these kind of like Christian influencers. Some of them are pastors. Some of them are just people in the church who are trying to use social for a good cause, but oftentimes they get a little obsessed with some of the small details. And so you'll have someone post with their branding, it's a scripture, it's Jesus speaking. And instead of having the reference, they have a reference, but right underneath the reference, it says their name or their logo, right? Like you're afraid of someone taking this quote, which is not your quote, and giving it to someone else. So you put your name on it, but it's actually Jesus's words.
Yeah.
It's funny to me that we feel like we have to brand everything, man. I got to brand it just in case I'm like, that's not how influencing works. Even in a social realm, you know, it's not about like some of the biggest influencers that are out there that maybe not even in the Christian world, don't have their name or logo slapped on their media itself, right? Like there's other ways that they're attaching it.
Yeah.
And so I've always found that fun to look at. It's like you have all these scriptures and it's like super hyper branded to, not even like a campaign or something, but the actual person's name. I'm like, Jesus said that. You didn't say that.
Yeah.
I'm like, I'm glad you're saying
careful.
it.
All we're saying is be careful, maybe.
I'm glad you're saying it. But I think the bigger question to ask is, why do you feel compelled to do that? What is it that says,
that's a good check.
Yeah. Is it because
I think it's a pride thing too.
Yeah, maybe so.
Like checking that pride. And that's everything. That's in everything, no matter what industry.
No, it doesn't matter where you're at. But is it because, I mean, I take this with the grain of salt that it is, coming from, we run an agency that serves churches, but the role of branding is to mark everything as yours. It's something kind of like separate from gospel-centered ideology there, because like it's about giving things away, right? The gospel is about giving credit, not taking credit, and we want to take all the credit. We want it. And so I think if we focused our storytelling from that mindset, man, this is about giving credit, like to God for what He's done in our lives. Like it's easy to just like put a set of rules there for yourself. Don't make it some weird thing. This is how we decide if we positioned this with God first or with us first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, those are good questions. And like that, just going back to the process thing, that should be a part of your storytelling process, like a constant check. Maybe it's written, maybe it's even written. Hey, why aren't we telling this story?
Let's get into that. I want to get into that in a minute.
Every single time. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I want to get into that in a minute. But first, I have a question. So, in a corporate setting, not like corporate business setting, but in a organizational setting, how do I focus on telling individual stories rather than the numbers that go with them alone? Right. So I think in that process, we've talked a little bit about this. That we all have jobs in the organization that are pretty different. Like I might be in this department, you might be in that department. So how do we as a group focus on telling these stories in the best way possible?
Yeah, I think just knowing, hey, like everybody does have a job, like there are people who are going to be more administrative minded. There are people who are much more creative minded, who understand the intricacies of like how we're going to do this, whether it's a social campaign, whether it's a graphic, a series design, something like that, or whether it's a video, for example. Everybody has a job. And so first of all, establishing where everybody's going to be on the process, because if you've laid out your process, like we talked about a while ago, and you have all these list of questions and everything, and these list of checks, knowing who's doing what after that. So somebody's going to go and find this person. Somebody's going to go through I think, I've never been on the administrative side of it, but from what I understand, like people will have like a list of stories that they'll go through from people, and somebody like goes through and figures out, okay, these are the best ones to tell. These are the best ones that are going to impact people the most. Everybody's story is important, obviously, but the bottom line is like some stories hit harder than others. And so finding those stories and then going after those people and saying, hey, would you be willing to do this? And each person on this endeavor is might be a different person, might have a different role and everything, but knowing that first before going into it, what should I be focused on? What portion of this should I be focused on?
I mean, maybe one key thing to do as an organization is decide, like, we're going to talk about some practical steps for process. And then we're also going to have some links on this blog to help you maybe adopt some of those elements into your organization. But I've been on the admin side. I've been in pastoral roles. I've been in all those different roles. And so there's been multiple sized organizations from, small local churches to much larger entities that have a global reach. And so the reality is, you do have to have some kind of process. And so that process isn't personal, meaning it's not reliant on solely individual connections. So it should be something that we're like, hey, we should have stories at domain.com, right? Like whatever. So people can go and say, hey, here's what God's doing in my life. I'm really excited about it. Like make it something that's exciting, make it a movement. But then you can also kind of vet which stories are going to be the best to put video behind, which ones are just the best with a photo and a social post, which ones are better written. Because not everybody you put a camera on is going to be able to tell a good story.
Right,
it's not. Like that's just the reality. Not everybody's a storyteller. They might have an incredible story, but they might not be a great storyteller. And I mean, you can put a camera in front of someone who's incredibly accomplished as a communicator and they lock up. It just doesn't, it doesn't matter. Like they could be a great preacher.
I panic.
Yeah.
I panic on the camera. It freaks me out bad.
You're the camera person and you panic when you put a camera on you. Like that, it's not even the thing with the technology.
I know my role.
Yeah. Hey,
I know my role and that's what I run with.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk a little bit about that because
that's
I think that first of all, something to think through is that not everybody who has a story is best to tell a story on video. So you need to find a process to vet that a little bit and identify where their story fits. The other piece of that is identifying in your organization once you have that process in place. So we know, all right, here's the things we're going to do, because you might have someone in administration who can help you identify these things. You might have someone on the ministry role. You might have volunteers, whatever the process is, it helps you identify the stories you want to tell. Now it's up to whose role is it to actually tell the story. And I think that's where sometimes as organizations, we get way out of control. Like everybody starts trying to tell everything in their own way. And that's not how it's going to work the best, because not everybody in an organization, again, you might have a story. It doesn't make you a storyteller. So let's talk about that, knowing the role, like whose responsibility is it to directly tell these stories? So if you're a creative, man, that's your role. That's your thing. If you're on the creative team.
Yeah, we're talking to you now.
We're talking to you now. So this is your role, right? So you guys need to put that process in place, go through as a team and decide who does what with what, like who goes in and talks to the individuals and figures out where they best fit as a story. Is this someone that we can videotape? Is this someone that we just need to set a process up to help them write it out and then we polish that and then that's something we release? Is it we schedule a photo and just do a little quick testimonial, like whatever the case is. And I would recommend getting a personal release for that content from them. So it should just be an easy signed document. We can put a template to one in this podcast, a video and photo release document that kind of covers you as an organization from being able to use their visage in their story. Again, not for the purposes of like hyper branding your organization, but you do want to protect yourself. Because hey, you get a story from somebody, they might not realize you're going to share it. And so this also helps you weed out, hey, there's language you can put when you're collecting that story and language you can put on the documents that helps them understand how you're going to use that story. Because you never know who in your church might be in some kind of protective services scenario. And so they might be wanting to tell their story to you, but might not be a story that should be publicly shared for the safety of them. And so that's something you have to consider, the person behind all this too. So, but going back to you as the creative, Tristan, talk to us a little bit about, how can you've been in church world where this is a gray area. And so you've seen potentially the confusion that sets in when it's not clear whose role it is to tell a story. What's that like?
Yeah, no, talking about that gray area, I think that's like one of the most important things to clear up. And a lot of times I say, like, I make generalizations like, oh, this is good, like across every industry. But the bottom line is the more questions you can ask to clear up what your responsibility is, the more protected you're going to be, as you know, in your job and everything. You're going to be a lot more protected in like, okay, well, I knew this, I knew this, I knew this, I knew this. This thing that didn't happen was outside of what I was supposed to do. So for one, you're covering yourself. That's like the most corporate side of it. And then also like, you're going to do better. You're going to perform better. You're going to be more well equipped to do your best the more you know exactly what you're supposed to do. And the more that you know what somebody else is going to do. Because, you know, in our organization, for example, like I edit videos. I don't, you know, email clients and everything. And I know that I'm not going to do that. Like, I know that that's not my role. And our project managers know that that's not my role. And they know theirs and I know mine. And there's no confusion because all those questions have been answered and everything. So I think when you reduce that gray area of what's my job, what's not my job, you're going to be, like I said, better equipped to do your best. And so is your team. So are your team members. Like you don't want to, at no point do you want to leave your team members high and dry. And if they know what they're supposed to do and you know what you're supposed to do, then I think you're going to perform your best. So that's kind of like my take on the general idea of it. And like the more specific stuff, if you're a videographer, your job is to film and edit and do your best at both of those. If you're a photographer, your job is to, you know, take photos and edit and do your best at that. And everything else at that point, you bring your team in on, but your job is to execute the creative side of it. And so that's kind of what I'm,
well, I think there's something to, you know, clarify there too, on the creative side of storytelling. The first thing you need to identify isn't actually, you know, how do we want to film and edit this piece? The first thing you want to identify is how do we brand?
Right, there's a lot that goes into it.
Or if we're going to release a story, is it going to be branded graphically through the series concept that we're currently in? Or do we have a set a campaign that we're going right now, that we're running right now as a church? Or do we have a preset kind of layout graphically from our brand as an organization that we want to wrap this in? So that you know, all that goes into identifying how you lay these out, graphically for social, for photo releases, for articles that you post on your website, and of course for video, because you're going to have intro and lower thirds and transitions and stuff that graphically need to be represented. And so if you don't have that in place first, you're going to leave a lot up to the imagination and possibly add a layer of confusion to the mix. And so you may end up having multiple.
I would say definitely. You're definitely gonna add a layer of confusion.
Well, I mean, the thing is, so you have a video release of it, you have a photo release of it, you have a social release, and you have an article, and they all end up looking different. Like, that's not a cohesive front. Like, that's confusing.
Yeah.
You know, the other side of that, you know, really is identifying, like we talked about earlier, that process. So I wanted to talk real quick about, like, what are some of the most practical ways to tell these stories of life change in your organization? Obviously, we just talked about some of them. We talked about video. We talked about social pieces. We talked about photography. We talked about, you know, articles that you publish on your website. If you don't actively publish articles on your site about different topics, you're kind of missing out on a pretty big SEO boost, so search engine optimization boost, because
honestly,
it's going to create a lot more content. I think churches struggle really often with content creation. But the crazy thing about that is they're developing so much content on a weekly basis that only ever is used once.
Weekly basis,
right? Like you got 52 or 51 weeks a year if you take off a Sabbath Sunday or whatever, right? So, you know, at least 50 weeks a year that you're doing something on a Sunday, and all the preparation that goes into that lives once. So you have sermon notes that are broken down and spoken once that could be taken and reused for helping tell other stories, reused for articles, reused for blogs. Like, you could break it out and make it evergreen content. You have all these story videos that we tend to associate with one weekend, Maybe it's a baptism weekend and we want to show stories, but we don't really talk about it after that. We don't put it in a place where people can find those stories, right? And so how you organize that information and release it can help you be a better content generator as an organization to tell better stories. And as part of that, comes into this. So talk to me a little bit, Tristan, about some of the ways that you've seen organizations tell stories in a better, more practical way.
Yeah, I think that, we've kind of covered a lot of it, and we've talked a lot about story videos, for example, because that's what me and Kev are like doing mostly when we're telling stories for a church. We're doing it through video and everything most typically. But that's a great way to do it. I think it's when you throw together creative lighting, when you put together, really cool angles, and you utilize your set, and then throw all that together with a music bed that's really powerful. It's the same feeling, if not more. A lot of times I would say more powerful than watching the best movie you've ever watched in your life. If you do it right, it will hit you that hard. Because especially, us as Christians and everything who have experienced a life-changing moment with Jesus, it kind of reminds us of that time that we were wrecked like that. And so video is a great way to do it. And we have resources on how you can do that. And then also we love to do that. So that's one thing that we would always love to do. And then also photos. Photos is a great way. Photos that you can take up to 10 and throw them on Instagram from a Sunday or however you do. I'm not going to speak into the how to do social. I don't know. But photos are a great way to tell stories. You're capturing a moment when Jesus wrecks somebody's heart. And if you can capture that and share it with people in a powerful way, then do it. If you have somebody on your team, or if you're someone who's passionate about photography, then get out there and like capture these moments, because it's the exact moment. When you get hands up, when you get tears coming down and all that stuff, like it's really powerful. So photography is a great way to do it. Video is a great way to do it. And then did you have something, Kev?
I was going to say, not just photo on a Sunday, but think about like if you're recording a story video, go ahead and bring a photographer out and do some lifestyle photos with the person whose story you're telling, because you're going to want to release that on a number of mediums, from Instagram stories to blog posts, to like wherever that's going to live. A lot of times we don't think about that until it's too late. And then we're, all we got is video, and we're trying to pull stills from a video. And we're like, oh man, I don't really like that lighting. You can make it work. You
make a weird face.
You can make it work, but it's like, it's better to do it intentionally from the get-go. And so part of that comes with, all right, so we talked a little bit about process. So, and here's a few checklists for you as an organization. If you want to tell the best stories. Number one, have a process. So the first thing is, you can't just be like, hey, we're going to tell a story this weekend. Man, if you've never talked about telling stories before and you're just going to decide to do it, you're starting in the wrong place. First thing is, what does our process look like, right? So what system do we use to track it? Is that a project management platform? Or are we using our church database system? Do we have an Excel spreadsheet? Like, what are we using to determine where these stories live? You got to determine where the stories could live, right? Are they're video, social only, blog, like whatever those different uses could possibly be for those stories. What system are you using to collect them? Is there a type form you've set up somewhere where they can submit, their story, and then it goes to your team to review. And then obviously you have the creative side of telling that. And so from that looks like, all right, do you have a place set up at your church to do this? Or are you having to set it up every time, right? You want to have proper lighting. Yeah. You want to have proper equipment. You want to have a place that's not noisy to tell a story, because from our experience, when you're capturing a story video, it can be a very intimate moment. The last thing you want to have happen is like you get to that place where someone actually breaks the third wall, kind of like goes full, like they take their guard down and they're getting emotional. And then someone walks in and like ruins the moment because you happen to be in an office instead of in a controlled environment. So the place where you tell a story matters. Make sure you capture it with multiple forms of audio, multiple angles of video, so that you're able to edit it and avoid any mistakes. And then, of course, how do you graphically want to present that? Is it tied to your series? Is it tied to a campaign? Is it tied to the brand? And then what mediums are you releasing it in? And so we're going to post a link to these thoughts in the article so you can go through and see it, and maybe even a download guide of how you could utilize some of these things. We've also, in the past, we've talked about a photo shoot kind of checklist for Sunday morning. So we're going to post that as a downloadable file for your organization to use on Sundays. And then maybe some other ideas about how you could use photography outside of the Sunday morning experience. So tell your story. There's so many ways to creatively tell stories of life change in church or in a church setting, but like overall, there's so many ways that you can do it. I think any way that you can think with your creative mind to tell a story, you can do it. Just one thing, going back to what you said about like, don't plan it a week in advance. Please don't plan your story videos a week in advance. You run the risk of hurting the person who's telling the story, who's being vulnerable with you, and you not having been prepared. And that's, I think, one of the most harmful things that you could do. There's a lot of great ways to tell people's stories, but there can be ways to hurt people. And so I don't want to end like that, but I want people to be mindful of like, you are getting someone in one of the most vulnerable places that they can be. And it's a big deal, and it's not to be taken lightly. And obviously we want to tell those stories and everything, but we want to be honorable to the people who are sharing that with us. And even from a purely tell stories, go and tell stories. Yeah. Well, even from a purely cinematic standpoint. So, if you're only allowing a week, number one, so you got to set up a production, you got to schedule that with a person. You got to get the place organized so that, there's not going to be interruptions. You get all the content, you sync it all up, and you start cutting. We use a tool called Sonics when we're editing video because we like to upload the raw interview to a tool that transcribes it. So we then can go into that transcription, find the time codes of the places we actually want to cut, and then we take it into edit so that we're not just having to listen to an hour-long interview in real time. It makes it much faster because you can kind of cut out what we want, and we know exactly where we want to go in the time code. But we know we've done this for years. So this is our process. If you're working at a church in a part-time role, maybe your other jobs like youth pastor, and you're also editing videos, you got a lot more going on in a week. You're not going to be able to turn that around in a week. And so you're just going to have straight video angles of this person. So when you're doing that shoot, the best thing to do is also get some B-roll of that person. Ask them if they could submit, after they get the story down, if they could submit any photos or content they have affiliated or associated with the story they told you. If you have more time to prepare, you can do a full-blown B-roll shoot of any of the areas that they're talking about. Like they say, man, this happened when I was at my school. Man, go film the school. But you can't do that if you only got a week, right? You're going to run out of windows. You're going to run out of time. Yeah. And so the more time you have to think ahead, and this goes back to what we talk about all the time, planning your creative year out. Like if you really get committed to planning your creative year as an organization and really invite the Holy Spirit into the planning as much as you do in the moment, you can get way ahead on these types of creative projects and make some stellar content. Like we talk all the time, we believe that the church is the hope of the world. And we think the church should be leading the edge creatively, but we're not. It's not, we're not there because God's not God. We're not there because we don't have a process in place like everyone else who's creating stellar content does. We just don't. And no offense to anybody who's a fan of Christian movies, there is a major quality difference. If you're going to compare movies made by a studio that's dedicated just by Christians in that process, or by even Christian music, sometimes you can listen to it and you're like, man, I can kind of tell how much they spent on this from a mastering perspective versus this other song that so-and-so spent. You can hear the difference.
Yeah.
And so you can see the difference on video. I'm not knocking anybody who's into that. I think it's great that people are trying to do that. But if we really want to push the envelope, we got to be dedicated to our craft, and we got to be dedicated to the process. And so if you're a local church, you're not trying to win a Grammy or release a movie that's going to, you know, get into theaters. That's not what your goal is. But you can get really good at telling stories in a very creative way. And you can do it if you get organized. Yeah. So
heck yeah. No, that's good. That's good. Like I think it's the theme of every episode is like the more organized you can be and the more planned out you can be and prepared for your creative endeavors, the more you're going to see them fly and everything. And the better you'll feel that you're getting at it. I think all of this just goes back to like developing craft, whether you're a video editor or whether you're a pastor in a church, you have a craft. And I think more than anything, our heart is just to see that be developed. Not just in individuals, but in the church as a whole, because we're doing that. We're working to develop our craft still. We're no professional, we're professionals, but we're not, you know, the best in the business at everything that we do, but we constantly strive to get better. And we constantly try to be more prepared with everything that we do. And so we just want to see that across the board and everything. And we're excited for what you're doing. And we're excited for the stories that you're going to tell. And we can't wait to see them. And hey, like if you're doing stuff in-house, tag us. Like we'd love to see it. And yeah, we love you guys. And heck yeah. Big support. Big support from me.
We love to see it. Well, thank you guys again for listening to the Yellowbox podcast, for watching the Yellowbox podcast, for tuning in to check out what we're up to. Like we said earlier, there's going to be some links and downloads on this episode because we really believe in storytelling. We want to make sure that we're equipping people with the best ways to tell stories. So tune in next time. Much love. Talk to you soon.